Hey everybody, this is Jacqueline Luqman, and I'm trying to straighten you out a little bit. Straighten me out. Let's see how well that works. Uh, today we are honoring the memory, the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's interesting how we do that in this country, because we talk a lot about how he was a champion of nonviolence, but we don't talk about the fact that he was a champion of direct action. And usually people who talk about how King was an advocate for nonviolence don't like to talk about the fact that he advocated bringing the problems of racial and social injustice in America into the streets, into the living rooms of American citizens, to make people uncomfortable, to make them aware, yes, but to absolutely make people uncomfortable with the situation as it exists. And, I thought a lot about King's legacy. I think a lot about how we honor him. And I realized as I was talking to a couple of people online today that the way we honor him kind of helps us keep him in this little convenient box that we like to put him in. Because when we honor Martin Luther King Jr., we focus on the day of his birth. And that's great, because if he had not been born, he wouldn't have been able to do the wonderful things that he did. But see, when we focus on the day that he was born, we are allowed to forget or overlook what he was doing on the day that he died. And that's really, really important, especially when we are looking at the kinds of racial and social injustices and inequalities that are still going on in this country today. So when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., we focus on his birth and we talk about him solely in the context of he was a civil rights leader, and he was a champion of nonviolence, and, he had this lofty dream of a colorblind society. Every Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we talk about how he had this dream, right? And we ignore, though, what he said about the nightmare that we had to realize, that we had to confront, and that we had to resolve before we can realize the dream that he had. See, we talk so much about that great "I have a dream" speech, but we don't talk about what he said about this country before he got to his dream. I am not going to read the whole thing, but maybe these are some things you don't know and haven't heard about what Martin Luther King Jr. said about the realities that he knew Black people faced in this country then in 1963. He said, "The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check." I do not know what's going on with my equipment here. It just all of a sudden decided to stop. But let me go back. Let me pick up. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. See, because we focus so much on the day Martin Luther King was born, we don't talk about what he said about America and its relationship with black people before he got to the wonderful dream of what some people believe he meant as a colorblind society. They never want to talk about the parts in his speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that outlined the moral bankruptcy that black people in this country and Native people and people of other oppressed groups have experienced at the hands of a government that proved again and again that it did not care about them. Because they only focus on the day he was born, they can control the narrative that all Martin Luther King Jr. said was that he had a dream. But that's not the only thing he said. And talking about that dream is not the only thing he did. When we focus only on his dream and not the reality we talked about, we can do things like use his focus on nonviolence against people who are still fighting for equality and justice today when we do things like block traffic. And these very same people who ignore everything else Martin Luther King Jr. said that day can say things like, well, is this what Dr. King would have wanted? Dr. King wouldn't have wanted you to behave this way. It's interesting that not only do people not focus on all of the other things that King said about America's moral bankruptcy when it comes to equality and justice for black people in that speech in 1963, they also conveniently forget what he said about the riots that happened across this country as a direct result of racism, injustice, and inequality that was going on in a lot of cities across this country just 3 years later in 1966. In an interview with Mike Wallace, where Mike Wallace was asking Dr. King what he thought about these riots that were popping up in all of these cities. And what America wanted Dr. King to do was to condemn the riots. And while he did not like the violence, Dr. King said something then in 1966 in this interview with Mike Wallace that Americans continue to ignore today. He said, I will agree that there is a group in the Negro community advocating violence now. I happen to feel that this group represents a numerical minority. Surveys have revealed this. The vast majority of Negroes still feel that the best way to deal with the dilemma that we face in this country is through nonviolent resistance. And I don't think this vocal group will be able to make a real dent in the Negro community in terms of swaying 22 million Negroes to this particular point of view. And I contend that the cry of Black Power is at bottom a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kind of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro. I think that we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. That was in 1966, 3 years, just 3 short years after Martin Luther King's iconic speech called the I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Dr. King went on to say in this interview, after Mike Wallace asked him, how many summers like this do you imagine that we can expect? Dr. King said, well, I would say this, we don't have long. Hey, Christopher, thanks for joining me. Dr. King said the mood of the Negro community now is one of urgency, one of saying that we aren't going to wait, that we've got to have our freedom. We've waited too long, so that I would say that every summer we're going to have this kind of vigorous protest. Hey, George, my hope, Dr. King said, is that it will be nonviolent. I would hope that we can avoid riots because riots are self-defeating and socially destructive. I would hope that we can avoid riots, but that we would be as militant and as determined next summer and through the winter as we have been this summer. And I think the answer about how long it will take, this is what Dr. King said now. I think the answer about how long it will take will depend upon the federal government, on the city halls of our various cities, and on white America to a large extent. This is where we are at this point in 1966. And I think white America will determine how long it will be and which way we go in the future. That is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1966 when asked how long there would be this unrest in black communities across America. But because we focus so much on the day he was born, we can put him in that little box, that little I have a dream box, that little let's be nonviolent box. And we don't pay any attention to the urgency of his militancy that he advocated too, along with direct action. He absolutely had a dream. But in order to realize that dream, Dr. King knew that we had to be honest about the reality we lived in. We had to be honest about that so that we could confront it. And we had to be militant and persistent using direct action to address it so that we could realize the dream. Hey, Leanne. But we like to keep him in the I have a dream, my little children are holding hands and walking down the street in a colorblind society box. Whenever black people lead the charge today against injustice and inequality, pointing out how we suffer under it disproportionately more than most other groups of people, with the exception of Native Americans. And we contend that if this country were to address seriously and completely address the systemic racism and inequality and injustice targeted at black people, then that would open the door to justice and equality for all every time we lead this charge, every time we have this conversation. You know what we're always told by people. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. It's not just about black people. Absolutely true, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't only focused on the issues that faced black people, especially toward the end of his life. And I'll get to that in a minute. But make no mistake, Martin Luther King Jr. made it very clear that justice for everyone else is inextricably tied to the measure of justice black people receive in this country. Let me see if I can find that link. He said in 1963, also in that speech, where he extolled these images of racial harmony. Like I said, children holding hands, black and white, breaking bread together. That's absolutely what we aspired to, what he believed this nation could aspire to, what I believe this nation can actually aspire to if we actually want to. But what he knew was true was that if this country continued to ignore its moral responsibility to the people who built this country, and I mean literally built it with free and forced slave labor that we have never been compensated for, if we are not given justice and equality, then how can anyone be expected to receive justice and equality in this country? So Dr. King was very clear on justice for all being inextricably tied to the pursuit and the realization of justice for black people. But we like to put him in the I have a dream box because we don't focus on what he was doing the day that he died, because we spend so much time focusing on the day he was born, and it's easier for us to ignore what he really, really stood for and what he almost accomplished. Hey, Karen, I have missed you too. Thank you. So what was so special about the day that Martin Luther King Jr. died, April 4th, 1968, that makes me think we need to focus more on it? In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was working on the Poor People's Campaign. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it was organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Council, of which King was a member. And he was helping to organize the Poor People's Campaign with them and some other people. And the campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, was designed to address issues of unemployment, housing shortages, and poverty among all Americans. You see, yes, Martin Luther King Jr.'s very first mission, his first charge, the job that he believed God sent him here to do, let's not lose sight of the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister before he was anything else. So he believed that he had been called to do this work, even though he was selected to be the leader of the civil rights movement by the SCLC. But he believed this was his calling as a Christian, to fight for justice on behalf of the oppressed, which is what the Bible actually commands us to do. So, yeah, his first charge was absolutely to fight for justice and equality for his people, for black people, to fight for civil rights and voting rights for black people, full citizenship. But again, when we fight for justice on behalf of black people, that opens the door to justice for everyone. And Martin Luther King Jr. was just moving into the next phase of the fight for justice in this country. Justice for the poor. All of the poor. Predominantly African-American poor, but the Poor People's Campaign focused on and included poor people from Latino communities from Southern California who joined, poor white people from Appalachia who joined, obviously poor black people from urban areas and from the South. So the Poor People's Campaign was organized to secure federal legislation to ensure, this ought to sound familiar, to ensure full employment and affordable housing for the poor. The original goal was to plan a nationwide march on April 22nd, 1968. That was the original date of the Poor People's March on Washington, to focus the nation's attention on the plight of the poor and to get Congress to pass legislation on employment, guaranteeing full employment and guaranteeing affordable and quality housing for the poor. This is the direct action that needed to be done next, because the direct action that was done in the civil rights movement actually resulted in legislation that changed this society. It was expected, on the heels of the success of the civil rights movement, on the heels of the respect that Dr. Martin Luther King had garnered in not just racial circles, not just social justice circles, but in some of American society. And here is where I think I need to make it really clear. We also need to clear up this misperception that Martin Luther King Jr. was just beloved by everybody in this country. Everybody loved MLK. No, they really didn't. They really didn't. Yes, the National Mall was full of people of all walks of life who were supporting Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and civil rights and voting rights for black people in 1963. But there were plenty more people in this country, black and white, Christian and non-believers, who hated King. As a matter of fact, after Martin Luther King Jr. started to speak out against the Vietnam War, he even became unpopular in the black community because, we don't like to make the white man angry. We don't. We're scared of that. We don't want white people to be upset with us. That's just the truth. And that's from many, many years of conditioning in a society that convinces you that in order for you to have freedom, you have to always agree with those who are in power, or else you're going to be in trouble. But that's another live stream. I don't want to get off track. So by the time 1968 comes around and the SCLC is planning this enormous Poor People's March on Washington, they also planned, in conjunction with the march, the erection of a tent city on the National Mall that was intended to remain in place until Congress met the demands of the SCLC. What were those demands again? Guaranteed full employment and guaranteed affordable quality housing for the poor. The tent city was called Resurrection City. And remember, the March on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign March on Washington, was planned for April 22nd, 1968. Poor white people, poor Latinos, poor black people, poor people of every walk of life, poor Native Americans from the reservations were planning to descend on Washington, D.C. to demand justice and equality for the poor. But Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. In the wake of his assassination, there was uncertainty in the SCLC about whether they should go forward with their plans. Remember, the original date for the Poor People's March on Washington was April 22nd. The SCLC decided to appoint Dr. James Abernathy as the leader of the campaign now, and they went ahead with the march. They went ahead with the plans to build Resurrection City, the tent city on the mall. The march was actually postponed, though, to May 12th. And in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated, you remember seeing all the newsreels of people crying in the streets. This is after decades of people fighting against a system that did not want to give black people civil rights, voting rights, and the person that many saw as the leader of the movement to obtain the barest of minimum of those was just murdered. So you can imagine that the attendance of the Poor People's March on Washington was drastically impacted. Instead of the 50,000 people that could have easily shown up, was expected to be in attendance at that march, 5,000 to 7,000 showed up. Resurrection City was installed, but something else happened. On June 5th, 1968, one of the most ardent supporters of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign in Congress was assassinated. That was Robert F. Kennedy. Resurrection City was closed on June 19th. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of an American society in which his little children could walk hand in hand with children of other races and everyone enjoy equality and justice, in effect, died. So when people ask me, what would have happened if Martin Luther King Jr. had lived? That's not an unusual thing for me to imagine, because I know what he was working on when he died. I know what he was working toward when he died. I know what he was fighting for when he died. He was fighting for, interestingly enough, the very same things that we just rejected in this last Democratic primary. Some people were very offended when people said that Bernie Sanders was carrying the mantle of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of black people were really offended by that. But it's not untrue. Because the same policies that Bernie Sanders advocated for, Dr. Martin Luther King actually advocated for them then. And he was prepared to come to Washington using persistent, militant, in-your-face direct action and force Congress to act on and implement those policies. That's what the Poor People's March on Washington was about. That is what Resurrection City was installed for. Every day to remind Congress, you have a duty to do better by the poor people of this country, and we will be here until you do. Every day reminding you of the people you are shortchanging. But the wind was taken out of the sails of the people who were fighting for justice, because those people were taken from us. What better way to kill a movement than to kill its leaders? There's no better way to kill a movement than to kill its champions. And when you look at the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the assassination of Robert Kennedy, how can you not see that this country, that there were forces in this country that had a vested interest in making sure the Poor People's Campaign was never successful? And it is because we focus so much on the birth of Martin Luther King Jr. that we can use that convenient focus, and we can block out all the stuff he did later on at his death. We don't have to deal with that inconvenient history that he was fighting for the very thing that we just said is too lofty for us to do. The very things that we just said in this last primary election that we need to be more practical about pursuing. It wasn't too practical for Martin Luther King Jr. to demand a guaranteed full employment legislation in 1968. It wasn't too impractical for Martin Luther King Jr. to demand a federal guarantee for affordable, quality housing for the poor in 1968. What happened to the dream we keep commemorating every January 15th? I'll tell you what happened. We left out the steps that he told us we have to follow in order to realize that dream. So every January 15th, I actually do think about the day Martin Luther King was assassinated. Because I know that had he lived, we would live in a different America. Would it be the perfect egalitarian utopia that maybe many people thought he was extolling in his dream? I don't know. But I do know that the inequality between black people and white people, the inequality between the poor and the wealthy, the inequality between the 1% and all the rest of us wouldn't be as enormous as it is today. And as much as I know many people can't stand conspiracy theories, look, just because it's a conspiracy theory, it doesn't mean it's not true. when you look at the state of our government today and the interests that control our government, how can you not feel as if the assassination of Dr. King and the assassination of Robert Kennedy wasn't an intentional act, two intentional acts to ensure that the poor, that blacks, that Native Americans, that LGBTQ people, that women, that the disabled aren't given full and equal access and justice in this society? Because you see, the more of us who are allowed to have a fair and equal slice of the pie, the less of that pie exists for those at the top. And they couldn't have that, could they? So what does that mean for us today as I wrap up? I'm going to post some links to some of my sources so you can read Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in 1963 for yourself. Yes, he advocated nonviolence. Yes, he absolutely advocated for us not to meet violence with violence and not to meet hatred with hatred, but he also advocated militancy. Militant ain't a bad word. He also advocated direct action, and he advocated doing it until. Our charge today is not just to remember the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. No, we honor him by remembering his death and what he was doing when he died. Our charge, ladies and gentlemen, is to continue the work he was doing when he died. We can't do that if we only focus on his dream. We have got to deal with the realities we are living under and change them. So thank you for watching. Please share this video and share the information I'm going to provide. And stay tuned to Coffee Current Events and Politics in Lukman Nation for more stuff from me. Peace, y'all, and have a great evening.